So you know about the U.S. Constitution, right? But what about the government that came before it? America's first shot at self-rule was something called the Articles of Confederation. And, well, it was a bit of a flawed experiment. Today we're going to get into why it was created, exactly where it all went wrong, and how its spectacular failure actually paved the way for the nation we have today.
And listen, this wasn't some big secret that only became obvious later. People on the inside knew it was a problem from the get-go. As early as 1780, you have guys like Alexander Hamilton basically shouting from the rooftops that the system was broken. This quote just nails it. The government wasn't working in wartime, and it wasn't working in peacetime. It was a crisis from day one.
So that begs the question, why on earth would they create a government that was so weak? Well, it wasn't an accident. In fact, that weakness, that was the whole point. You have to remember, they had just fought a revolution against what they saw as a tyrannical king and a powerful, centralized government in Britain. The last thing they wanted was to build another one of those themselves.
And that brings us to what this thing actually was. It was a confederation. The document itself called it a firm league of friendship. The best way to think about it is less like a single unified country and more like an alliance. Where independent states agree to cooperate on a few things, but mostly do their own thing. The states were the stars of the show. The national government was barely a supporting actor.
And when you look at the power split, man, it's really something. The states held on to all the important stuff. They're on sovereignty, freedom, independence, and a catch-all clause that said they kept any power they didn't explicitly give away. And the national government? It could declare war, but it couldn't raise an army to fight it. It could make treaties with other countries, but it had almost no power to actually enforce them. It was a government with a ton of responsibility and practically zero authority.
So this whole setup, it basically created a system that was designed for gridlock. It was just riddled with these fatal flaws that made governing almost impossible. So let's break down what those flaws actually were.
The consequences here were a total mess. Because the government couldn't tax anyone, it was perpetually broke. Without a national army, it couldn't defend the country. It couldn't regulate trade, so states were constantly fighting with each other over economic issues. And the rules for actually getting anything done, they were a perfect recipe for total, complete paralysis.
Get this, to pass any significant law, you needed 9 of the 13 states to agree. That's a supermajority. It was an incredibly high bar, and it meant that a small group of states could, and often did, block laws that the rest of the country wanted.
But if you thought that was tough, trying to fix the articles was, well, it was basically impossible. To change the document itself, you needed a unanimous vote. All 13 states had to agree. A single state could veto any change, which meant the country was stuck with a system that everybody knew was failing. Okay, so the most immediate, the most crippling problem here, it was money. Or the lack of it. The United States was born in debt from the Revolutionary War, but under the Articles, it had no real way to pay its bills. The nation was literally running on empty.
And the problem was really simple. The national government could ask the states for money, but it had no power to make them pay. It was basically a voluntary donation system. And you can guess how that worked out, right? States often just ignored the requests, or maybe they'd pay a tiny fraction of what was asked. The government was basically begging for cash.
And the results were, well, exactly what you'd expect. The U.S. couldn't pay back its war debts to countries like France, which completely destroyed its credit and reputation on the world stage. They tried a couple of times to create a national tax, like a simple 5% tax on imports, but both times they couldn't get that unanimous vote. The country was just spiraling towards bankruptcy. If the money problems were a slow-motion car crash, what happened next was the explosion that blew the whole thing up. In 1786, an uprising of farmers in Massachusetts called Shays' Rebellion showed everyone, in the most dramatic way possible, just how dangerously weak the national government really was. So here's what went down. First, you've got these impoverished Revolutionary War veterans, heroes, right? And they're losing their farms because they can't pay crushing state taxes. So they get organized and start physically shutting down the courts to stop the foreclosures. But then it escalates. Their leader, a guy named Daniel Shays, leads an armed assault on a federal weapons arsenal. And the national government's response? Crickets. Nothing. It was completely powerless. In the end, the rebellion had to be put down by a private militia paid for by rich guys from Boston. Shays' Rebellion was a terrifying wake-up call. It proved, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that the national government couldn't even keep the peace inside its own borders. It couldn't protect its own property or enforce the law. For leaders across the country, this was the moment they realized, this isn't working. The whole thing is a failure. And this event just ripped the founders apart.
You've got Thomas Jefferson over in Paris, kind of shrugging it off from a distance, saying, I like a little rebellion now and then. But George Washington, who's right there in the middle of it, he is absolutely horrified. He's mortified beyond expression, seeing the country he fought to create teetering on the brink of total chaos. The shock of Shays' rebellion was really the final nail in the coffin. It was the catalyst for change. The conversation wasn't about tweaking the articles anymore. It was about throwing them out and starting over. The country's leaders knew they needed a complete do-over.
It started small, with a meeting in Annapolis to try and solve some of the trade disputes between states. But the delegates there pretty quickly realized the problems were way too big for them to solve, so they made a pretty radical suggestion. Let's call for a huge convention, all the states, to meet in Philadelphia next year, not just to talk about trade, but to completely rethink the entire government.
And this quote from John Adams just hits the nail on the head when it comes to the core problem they were facing. After all those years under the Articles, people didn't really think of themselves as Americans yet. Their loyalty was to their state. A person's country was Virginia, or Massachusetts, or New York. The Articles of Confederation had completely failed to unite 13 states into one nation.
And so that brings them to Philadelphia in 1787. They showed up with a mandate to fix the Articles, but instead they threw the whole thing in the trash and started writing the Constitution. So we'll leave you with this thought. The first experiment is a total bust. You're a delegate walking into that convention, the country is broke and falling apart. What's the very first thing you're trying to fix?